Singapore would still be prosperous even without that level of control. It is not the authoritarianism that brought about the wealth, but its position.
Hi, this is the Ignoramus's Guide to Surviving Humanity. I'm Ileana Chan with my co-host Wei Chan and a very special guest, Mr. Tan Wah-Piow.
Hello, Ileana and Wei.
Hello, and Mr. Wah-Piow is a human rights lawyer, a Singaporean exile, and in the famous words of Lee Kuan Yew, a simpleton.
I agree. I wholeheartedly.
So, and why do we have Mr. Wah-Piow on today is because we've noticed that there's such a misconception, I think, about Southeast Asian activists and Asian activists in general. There's the misconception being that there are none, that Asians are innately quiet and passive and don't have any political ideas.
No, screw that. I'm sorry, that is so annoying.
Yeah, and me and Wei realized like that's not at all our upbringing. And actually sometimes when we're told, maybe, I don't know if you've been told this, but that I'm opinionated because of my Western upbringing, because of my Western values and my Western education. And it's like, well, actually the people that I grew up with that are the most opinionated and politically aware and passionate about justice are actually Southeast Asians that,
and your parents, right?
And my parents.
And my parents and the people around me. But I'm quite passionate about that because it really, really annoys me that people say that Asian people don't have opinions when, and then when we speak them out, all people do is get extremely offended.
Yeah,
but the problem is Asians, they grumble a lot, but in the silence of their home, within the four walls. And that is the problem. Although the generation is different, like both of you, ignoramus.
Yeah, so we're the ignoramuses.
And make it louder.
So my greater impression is that the forces of imperialism, US imperialism, and their co-conspirators, i.e.
the UK
and Lee Kuan Yew, have silenced you, have done everything that they could to silence you and your friends or your colleagues, and any kind of left-wing narratives coming out of Singapore. And so it is extremely ironic to then, for people to then turn around and say Asian people are silent, because in fact, in the words of Oprah, are they silent or were they silenced?
Yeah, Oprah. And full disclosure, me and Wei have known Mr. Wah-Piow for our whole lives.
Yeah, I think we agreed to just call him Wah-Piow today. Wah-Piow.
Sorry, trying to be professional here. Wah-Piow. Luckily, I didn't say Uncle Wah-Piow. Okay, so yes, we have known Wah-Piow for our whole lives, so we have that context. But we do want to say that yes, this idea of being silenced, the political cost. I mean, the cost that you yourself experience from being politically outspoken has led you to London. Could you give us a little bit of your background in terms of the Singaporean exile thing that we sort of briefly touched upon?
Oh, yes, okay. Right. Now, I came into exile to the United Kingdom in 1976. So now it's well over 4 decades. And the reason I had to go into exile was before that, I was the president of the University of Singapore Students' Union. And if you are president of the Student Union, and if you organize New Year balls and some charity and so on, that's absolutely fine, because then your career path is set. to be part of the establishment or to join the very comfortable upper middle class. But then if you choose, as I did at the time of my youth, to go into the advocacy for democracy, to advocate not just democracy as a concept, but to get workers around at the time when there was recession in Singapore, when you start organizing the workers, you start telling workers that, oh, well, you don't have spaces to speak. Come to our union house and we provide you with the facilities. Then that was not a career path that most Singaporeans would have chosen, especially when you are in a prestigious university. And that was what eventually led me to London. And it's true when you started the point about most Asians perceived to be to have no opinion and silent, and that was true at the time, although they have private opinions, but to have an opinion in public would be dangerous. And hence, at the time, there's not a single opposition in parliament. That is an indication of the mood at the time.
And they want you that way, don't they? That's what they want. They want a compliant, productive, submissive economic and military partner in Southeast Asia. And when I say they, I mean the UK and the US. That's what they wanted, and they were very complicit in helping the Singaporean government silence people like you.
Oh yes, it's not just silencing people like me, because at that time we helped to organize a group of workers even to demonstrate outside the US embassy. That was an American company called Gulf Plastic. So that kind of making that kind of noise against US investment, the low wages and so on, the abuse of the employment law for US monopoly interests, that is not welcome, or that was not welcome. And now, even now.
Right, so that's the kind of Asia they want. They want the cheap labor, they want no working conditions, so their corporations can go in and set up companies and use that cheap labor and extract all of that wealth and abuse at the expense of Southeast Asians and bring that profit back to the West.
But there is a caveat there. As long as you are making loud noise against the government they like to demonize, which is at the present moment China, then they would put on the headline when a Hong Kong Democrat comes to London. So, for example, when recently I raised the issue of the absolute silence within the political spectrum in Britain about the China bashing, and when I published an open letter, the only newspaper in Britain that bothers to publish it in full was the Morning Star. And yet they will publicize a Uyghur who wants to speak bad about China, a Hong Kong dissident who is not happy with Beijing. And that
they will always lionize somebody. Yeah, they will always lionize an activist who is speaking against a government that is not submissive to them.
As long as they uphold their own imperial agenda, then those people will be highlighted because it's part of the propaganda machine.
So this is like Venezuela, as far as I know, this is, and China, just to name two. But this is a pattern going all over the global South, where either you are a really submissive partner to the US, or you are an enemy and they will just overthrow you. And
Biden
push the regime change.
have just in the budget put in 300 million to promote the type of voices they like to hear.
Exactly.
300 million. And certainly I won't be getting, or you won't be getting that part of the budget.
Oh no, we did this all wrong.
300 million.
We did this all wrong way.
Can I just bring you back, because we're talking about the present, and I really love how this links in, because this has been US policy and CIA policy and NED policy, the National Endowment for Democracy policy, for the last 50 years or more, right? Since the 70s, and the 70s is kind of where you were campaigning, is that right?
Yes.
And what kind of workers' rights were you talking about there? You did mention it, so and I realized that this is 50 years ago, so
right.
This is,
the kind of rights issue was we had at the time when I was then 22. Probably I was the very few within the campus who was aware there's such a thing as political detainees, and people who then were in jail since 1963 until my time in 1974, and that detention continued. One of the poor guy, Chia Taipo, was detained for 33 years without trial, and he was a university lecturer. So that is the kind of human rights issue. The trade unions, workers were not able to organize. Trade unions are organized by the ruling party. That are the kind of issues that concern me.
Where did you get these ideas from initially?
Where did I get it? Well, probably in the place where I live in Singapore, in Joo Chiat, you have, it's the kind of lumpen proliferate area where people are not part of the establishment, maybe hawkers, small traders, and so on. They have a healthy skepticism about the government. It's not the more middle class area in Singapore. So I brought up in that kind of context, and also members of my families, my brothers, and so on, are in their own ways cynical about the government. In fact, the government even named one or two of my brothers as left-wingers, pro-communists, and so on. But that was the mood of the times in the 50s, in the 60s, where the Chinese educated were the most oppressed. They were at the forefront of the anti-colonial movement, and they were part of the anti-Japanese movement as well. So that was a social history, and that was why when Lee Kuan Yew came to power, the target was to marginalize the Chinese educated, which were the majority. You promote English education, and you give the best jobs only to those who are English educated. So you have that social divide according to language. And when you talk about killing a culture, it was basically that political process of killing the political social culture of the Chinese-speaking population, which happens to be the majority. But that is possible by pushing an education system where you take out Chinese education, and the Chinese education being relevant, because if you go back to history, a lot of progressive ideas came to Southeast Asia through Chinese intellectuals who were escaping China during the war. But that's too much into history now.
No, I don't think it's too much into history. I think we need some context, because the war, the world as we know it has been, the post-war, post-World War II world as we know it has been completely shaped by the West's obsession with communism, and also the fact that they wanted to continue to exploit the global South and they have done to this day. And that's why the global South is poor and the West is rich, and a couple of pick-me Asians, a couple of little allies like Singapore get to be rich.
Yeah, one of the things that you, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to just clarify a little bit on the workers' rights issue. So in fact, it wasn't even that you were advocating for workers' rights. It was that the people who would advocate for workers' rights were being put in prison.
Yes, precisely right.
And you were campaigning for them.
And I was really not so much campaigning for them, but then as the president of the student union and as a student union, we facilitated that. We provided the workers with information. For example, the trade union were instigating the employers to pay the trade union with coupons to buy groceries from supermarkets owned by the trade union. And we knew that this was illegal. So we use our position as people who are able to do the investigation, find out their rights, tell that to the workers, and that instigated them. Is the facts that instigated the workers to organize for their rights. And that was what we were doing. And that was a mortal sin politically.
And just to, I don't want to give the whole plot away or give your whole story away, but as a result, you were put in jail for 1 year.
Yes.
By the Singaporean government for your opinions, right?
Yes.
So was that the reason that they gave to arrest you?
Oh, they concocted a frame up that I rioted within the trade union office together with two workers. And that was a particular date in 1974. So we went for trial and I defended myself. Two other workers had their own lawyers, and the trial went on for 43 or 47 days, the longest trial at that time in Singapore. And we had even a journalist from the Straits Times who said that at the time of the so-called riot, the newspaperman was outside the trade union and he saw me across the road. He said that Tan Wah-Piow could not be causing a riot. And we have photographs to show all the things which happened to support our case. And there were probably at least 50, 60 to 100 people, workers and so on. And the reason why they need to create a frame up was to shut me up, to eventually, then they deported 7 of the leaders from the student union. Eventually, they basically shut down the entire student union as it then was, as a kind of democratic forum. And that was 1970, by 1975, 76, the student union was gone. So that is how a regime, a government cope with maintaining its dominance. And that is why on the face of it, you hardly hear dissident voices in Singapore because the price we had to pay was extremely high. But I mean, for me, that's part of so-called part of the deal. If you want to be rebellious, you have to be prepared for the price to pay. And luckily, I managed to eventually establish myself career-wise and so on. Had I remained in Singapore, I would be detained without trial for God knows when. Intellectually, that will prevent you from developing as well. Then you'll be stuck at the very very basic understanding of society without the opportunity to expand your worldview and understanding even of what you have believed. So that is the importance of an open society, which I still believe it's something Singaporeans should campaign for.
So there you go, the quiet Asians, right? So next time you think about calling Asian people quiet because of their Confucian values and all of that kind of stuff, and a focus on harmony, spare a thought for all the Asian activists who spoke out and were put in prison by a government backed by the US and backed by the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and I really want to sort of put to bed this myth, and it's so prevalent. It's still sort of, it's still now very much repeated. This idea that the idea of freedom of speech or, well, freedom in general, democracy in general, workers' rights, any of those things are Western ideologies that have no place in Asia. Like that, I think, is used time and time again to prop up authoritarian regimes in Asia.
Dictators, capitalist dictators.
Because, oh, these poor Asians can't possibly manage democracy, these Western ideas. I think that happens a lot.
But the complicity of the West is that they are now using democracy, using human rights as the weapon to demonize those that they disagree. This is their new mission. Like during the Opium War, during the 18th century and so on, they were using the Bible to justify why they are taking over people's land. And now they are using democracy to say, this is a country which is too nationalistic. You are going to beat me on technology. Let me attack you using human rights. And if we go back to one, I'm not talking about China, to a country that they like to demonize, and that is Iran. And if you go back to the Iranian history, even before the time of the Ayatollah, before the time of the Shah, the Iranians, Democrats were very, very strong. And in fact, they were very impressed by the rule of law in the United States. That was in the 1930s. And they were supported by the US until the nationalists discovered oil. And when oil was discovered, United States wanted, their oil company wanted to get into Iran, and that was where the nationalists say, we want to nationalize our oil. And that was when the US abandoned the constitutionalists. And that ended up with a very
nationalize your oil.
Yeah, that's right. So when it comes to oil, as we see even in the Middle East, if we look at Saddam Hussein, if you look at Libya, Gaddafi, they are, of course, dictators and so on. But one element is that they are nationalists and they were secular.
Right. There are plenty of dictators who the US has not overthrown. And the reason for that is, for example, Lee Kuan Yew. And the reason for that is because they are collaborating with the US. They're complicit, they're compliant, and they're allowing US companies into their place, and they're allowing the US to use Singapore as a military base, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh yeah, it was during the period of Cold War. Lee Kuan Yew's position was very clear. He was on the side of the US. In more recent times, people who are like Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, whom they could collaborate with insofar as they need to use them against their regional enemy, Iran or whatever. But the moment they push their nationalist position, then they will remove them, even though they were the bastion against conservative religious conservatism.
Mm-hmm.
So hence, that is a complexity. And this is where lots of Democrats in the West lack this worldview that when we talk about democracy, we also have to recognize the complexity of how, be careful of how the US was using it, as they did in Vietnam and so on. How many Vietnamese did they kill? If we look at, say, the Middle East war since 9/11, you have 800,000 lives killed. You have 21 million people displaced. And what you brought about are failed states and democracies. Who is made accountable for the 800,000 people died? Not a single person. Yet, if you recall the last 2 days on BBC, we have a big investigation, rightly so, into the terrorist bombing in was it Manchester? The death of 21 or 28 people. That's correctly doing an investigation. But why there's no investigation over the wars that killed 800,000 people?
You touched on how Iran nationalized their oil, and that's what you must never do is nationalize your own oil. And Venezuela did the same thing, didn't they? So Venezuela nationalized their oil. The US sanctioned them and basically I forgot specifically what the sanctions were, but wiped out 99% of their GDP with sanctions.
Oh, yes.
And then all the so-called left-wing newspapers in the West could report about is how Venezuela has been crippled by irresponsible economic policies by their socialist government, conveniently forgetting that the US just basically sanctioned them off the face of the planet. And when people talk about sanctions, we think it's sort of, something a little bit sort of, a little bit spiteful. Yeah, just oh, we're just going to sanction them. But some of these sanctions can wipe out a country's whole economy, and that is what's happened in Venezuela.
Sanctions is a weapon of war. If we look, China was sanctioned for 22 years after its liberation in 1949. Cuba, how could Cuba be a threat to United States? Even now that it is no longer a Soviet outpost in an area close to the United States, and that sanctions still continue. And that is a weapon of war against an ideology of nationalism that the United States are against. That is still a problem now.
So sanctioning, they wipe out your economy. They create social unrest. People are starving. There's no water. The services run down, and then people are unhappy with the government, and that's what they want. They want the people to overthrow the government. And as resistance increases from the people, they pick out individuals. When I say they, I mean the National Endowment for Democracy and the CIA. Pick out individual opposition activists to support, and they lionize them, and they try and support them to overthrow the current government. Unfortunately, that hasn't worked in Venezuela so far. But yeah, I mean, I really don't want to take a side or put any country's government on a pedestal, but there is no, that a government not being good is absolutely not a reason for the US to intervene.
Yes, because now they are using only one yardstick at the moment to define what is democracy. And that one yardstick is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. That theoretically is correct. You should have governments of this nature. But the benchmark of that yardstick is whether you have an electoral process. It is true that having an electoral process in the character of Westminster electoral system may be better than none at all. But having that system itself does not necessarily mean that is real representation. You live in England, you know to what extent are your views represented. In the United States, there is a big problem, a dysfunctional political system. And my point is, how can we allow 4.5% of the world's population, represented by Biden and Boris Johnson, to go around the world to be the judge of which government should be taken down and which is not, even within their own country, whether it is truly a democratic government? Is the world policeman at the moment that is threatening the possibility of war? And 2 days ago, there was a very good international forum where the Secretary General of CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, raised this point that the greatest threat to war at the moment are the West, United States, which have, and the West have 6,000 nuclear warheads against 350,000, 350 warheads in China.
In China, for example.
China has one military base in Djibouti, whereas United States has 800, and we are facing the prospect of a real prospect of an accident that can escalate into a nuclear war. And CND position is that we don't have to agree with the nitty-gritty aspects of issues in China. All we need to agree is everything has to be done to avert a war, which US and the West in the last 2 weeks are pushing.
Can I go back also to your point about parliamentary democracy, or sorry, I said parliamentary because this is the UK, but you know, US style electoral democracy, sorry, and how the definition of democracy is narrow, but yet ironically, many of the governments that the US overthrows were democratically elected, and I think that's So Maduro, for example, was democratically elected. The US wants to call that rigged, but I mean, I don't even, you know, that's just a narrative that they're putting forward with zero proof.
Yeah, it's again that thing that I was saying about how democracy is something the West has claimed for themselves, and they get to define it on their terms. Anytime a country does something they don't want, they'll just say they're anti-democratic.
Right.
But the yardstick keeps changing. So it's just like, even what is the yardstick that they're using right now? The US or the UK might not pass that yardstick either.
The main problem is we talk about the general population memory are short, determined by the last headline that they read in the tabloid. Who would remember about Chile, the Allende government that was popularly elected and then basically overthrown who remembers that? When we talk about using military and military coup, which are supported by the United States, we see that
is
in
that
Chile.
Democracy? Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is
We
a
see that
military
in
coup
Indonesia.
democracy? Yeah.
Yes.
And Singapore. Okay, Singapore is a parliamentary democracy. Yet Lee Kuan Yew ruled from what year until his death? And then his son is in power, 1959. So, and the US is calling Singapore a democracy because they have a parliamentary system,
but then
which is
they also
completely
call
worthless.
him,
Yeah.
but then they also call him a benevolent dictator. So
yeah, then they put everybody in prison who opposes them. Sure, yeah, you have a parliamentary democracy, but everyone who kind of opposes you label them as a radical communist and you put them in prison. So, how, where is the US pushing democracy? Where is democracy a Western value? And a lot of the time they kind of paint Singapore as, undemocratic or a dictatorship despite its partnership with the West. But I think it's very, very clear that it is a dictatorship because of the West.
Well, the degree of tolerance against either authoritarian government or government which are even fascistic depends on US self-interest. Singapore is an example in Southeast Asia where they would tolerate those repression which are typical of authoritarian state. But if we look at Saudi is the other extreme example, which is the most conservative state whose values are completely different from the West. Remember the last few days when they talk about our Western values and so on. But Saudi is the best of friends. Even if we look at Israel, Israel has elections and so on, but inherently Israel treatment of the Palestinians are absolutely unacceptable, absolutely contrary to Western values. But
and they can't vote.
They are really, they are tolerated.
Yeah, they can't vote. So where is the democracy?
No. And the Palestinians actually are the most oppressed people in the world in terms of their lived experience, the Palestinians. And how are Western values reflected in their relationship with Israel, even condoning everything that Israel does? And that is the irony, which the Western population, aided and abetted by the media, close an eye. And that is the crazy world that we are in when there is no consistency.
I mean, it sounds crazy and it sounds like, people have short memories and, we can say all these things, but it is, I think, a concentrated and orchestrated campaign, right? It is like, this is imperial propaganda. It's on purpose that the vast majority of people in Western countries have no clue about other countries. Like, it's on purpose that their narratives that they're fed are so xenophobic. Like, that's to further the imperialist agenda. I mean, I would kind of think of the way most people think of Singapore is kind of like Singapore is the personification of the model minority myth. It's like, they don't need freedoms. They don't need, they just need to work really hard and look how well they're doing because they just shut up and work really hard.
And the West praises them for this. The Guardian praises them for this. So-called left-wing paper, The Guardian, praises Singapore in Lee Kuan Yew's obituary, which I have up on my screen. Two stories. Obituaries about Lee Kuan Yew, who fortunately died when? 5 years ago.
few years ago.
A few years ago. And this is what really made me kind of start to think about this again. And I would tell people about your story because you know, most of the business papers were writing these obituaries about Lee Kuan Yew. He's the founder of Singapore, the architect of Singapore's success. He was a bit of a dictator, but you know, it was worth it, you know. And my jaw was just dropping that people would uncritically consume these stories, that The Guardian would uncritically consume this narrative of Lee Kuan Yew being the architect of Singapore's success.
I mean, not only, I mean, yeah, we should get into that a little bit more because I was quite ignorant about that myself, about why was Singapore successful. That's something I definitely want to talk about. But I do want to say that there is that racist overtones, the paternalistic racism of saying, well, Singaporean people are not capable. You know, there's that.
They don't want democracy,
Yeah, there's that idea of Lee Kuan Yew really helped them out because this was the only way that they could get out of wherever they were by being this sort of dictatorship that just gave people no choice. You know, it's that sort of racist narrative.
Yeah, you know, like the concept of human rights in the West and democracy, you know, that it's very difficult to translate for Asian people. You know, they have Confucian values, and it just doesn't, you know, it just doesn't really this concept of having a say in how you're ruled, that kind of thing doesn't translate well in Asia. And
No,
it is
I'll
racist.
come first on the point of Singapore's success. I mean, Singapore by any yardstick, materially and so on, is successful. But many do not understand that this success is not solely attributed to Lee Kuan Yew's policies. Many forgot that Singapore has at all times, in terms of Southeast Asia, even if we go back to the early 20th century, before its independence, was already an outstanding city. An outstanding city because the wealth came from the circulation of goods and services in the entire Southeast Asia. It was the trading that brought about the success. It was the trading that brought about that relative affluence compared to the rest, not just of Southeast Asia. Outside Tokyo, it was the most prosperous city even at the time. Now, a lot of British, even today, misunderstood, and politicians misunderstood that Singapore model can be the model for Brexit Britain. But don't forget that Singapore is a city-state with a population of just 5.4 million people. It's a city-state that can be easily controlled. But the wealth that the city-state has been able to accumulate is brought about apart from that trading. It is also a place where dictators and the corrupt in the region, then now from all over the world, would put in the money into the city-state. The amount of money that is earned from this unique position for fencing illegal ill-gain money is enormous. That is also another aspect which brought about the success, because there is no transparency. You cannot turn London into a city for fencing corrupt money. But in Singapore,
I mean, it kind of already is.
Yes, yes, it is.
It is a tax haven.
Not to the scale.
Yeah, not to the scale, right?
And
no, it has to be undercover.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, but there are a lot of city-state tax havens, Liechtenstein, Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, all of these places which are financial centers and trading hubs and city-states, and they're all rich. So is Lee Kuan Yew's model some kind of a bastion of or a shining example of free market economics? Not really. Almost all of the city-states in the world are very rich, especially if they happen to be banking and financial centers.
Yeah, city-states, authoritarian or not, will always have its wealth. I mean, if we go back to Venice, I mean, it was a city-state where it is a center for all the trade. And my point is that Singapore would still be prosperous even without that level of control. It is not the authoritarianism that brought about the wealth, but its position. And no doubt the lack of transparency helps to some degree. But even if you are more transparent, you might do away with some of the illegal money. But you will still be the center of trade and services. So for activists in some third world countries, I mean, I've been to Burma, even to Bangladesh, and some of them was asking me, can Singapore be a model for our country? No. I say, no, you are not a city-state. Burma is not a city-state, and neither is Bangladesh. And that is the point. People misunderstood that the success in Singapore is attributed to authoritarianism, which it is not.
Do you think there is anything that Lee Kuan Yew did that was maybe unique to Singapore that was good, I guess?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, the housing, it's he correctly addressed the housing needs, which was what the Hong Kong, the SAR administration have not learned. And Lee realized that housing is one of the social good, that if you satisfy the population, then half your political battle is won. But in addressing the issue of housing, he also used that as a mechanism for social control. So you have 87% of the population living in public housing, whether these housing are rented or owned. And that gives them the absolute monopoly over the control of the lives of people living in those units. And also with the control of such a big stock of housing, it is a very useful social asset where they can play the carrot and stick, because as the value of leased property decreases over time, at every election, you can fit in some carrots to say, oh, we will modernize part of the buildings owned by the state. And that immediately will be a vote winner. Or as the value of the property depreciates because the lease are coming to an end and became a social issue, extended by one means or another. So it was a clever system. That is one thing that they got it right. The second thing which is important to acknowledge is the education system. Although we were against it in the kind of elitist undertone and so on, but the efforts to to bring about kind of universal education that is controlled by the state in terms of funding and so on. Yeah, they got that right. But again, that is brought about because of the way the state was able to manage its resources. But having said that, don't forget that Singapore is ruled by a very small elite that controls the power. Now, that is a subject for a different discussion. I had written a few months ago an analysis of the situation, a kind of self-serving autocracy, which makes it possible for them to control the entire population. And they are less than probably 0.1% of the population. We see that also in United States, which is ruled by this 0.1%, 1% that dictates all social policies.
One thing that a lot of people forget to mention also is the huge boost in GDP that Singapore received by being a military base for the US and also for the UK. So as Singapore decolonized, the UK military spending continued on. And I read that at one point, UK military spending was about sort of 200 million a year at one point, which is about a fifth of Singapore's GDP, or was a fifth of Singapore's GDP at the time. So it is not always, you know, from innovation and this narrative that Singapore is rich because of its capitalism and its innovation and its discipline and things like that. I think that needs to be challenged.
I know just to correct you on that. That part of its contribution was very time specific at the earlier period of its independence to tide over that period, but eventually the earnings from that period from Western European Western military spending did decrease. But also on that point, actually Singapore earned a great deal out of the Vietnam War in servicing the American. That was big bucks at the time, in the 1970s, when it was still growing up.
So Singapore served as a base, a military base for a
huge US It serves presence. Well and it benefits. But again, that is why I say it's not a model. There are lots of historical incidents because of its position as an appendage of the West during the Cold War. And it benefited a lot and helps to build up the infrastructure and the wealth that then feeds the autocratic elite.
And in fact, Singapore, to some extent, is a huge military base, isn't it? And the if you drive down the road in Singapore, it's very, very wide. And there are plant pots in the middle instead of the road being separated into different roads. You have one huge road with plant pots in the middle or bollards in the middle, and those can be taken away at any time, so that the roads can be served as military roads. They're extra reinforced so that you can drive tanks over them or whatever. I don't know what it is. Is this right, or am I just speculating here?
Where that is you have an unfair advantage over me because I've not been able to be back in Singapore.
Yeah, sorry.
He's still not able to go back.
So if you set foot in Singapore, what would happen?
Well, they have already warned me not even to set foot in the Singapore embassy, let alone in Singapore.
Right.
And technically, I will be arrested. And in fact, that was made very clear to me a few years ago when my mother passed away, and the High Commissioner from Singapore, who was an old friend of mine during university days and served as a council member of the student union, telephoned to convey his personal condolences for my loss of my mother, but warned me that I may have the right to fly into Singapore, but they cannot guarantee my safety. So that's the situation.
And you're a British citizen now.
Technically, they would arrest me. And in fact, I understand there is the military of defense have my file, the Internal Security Department have my file, and there is a certain protocol which they have established since 1976 of how to deal with me upon my return to Singapore. And I don't think that has changed.
Why do you think, I mean, that's like 44 years later. And what sort of threat can you possibly be?
Right, I mean, I think that is where the Asian stereotype is true, is that Asians do tend to be very petty and hold a grudge for maybe 50 years. So I think,
it's the lesson that we will not forget and you will be punished. And that is to deter dissidents. It's not a political need otherwise of what threat a person poses, but the message that we will punish you.
But
and that
so
is the
few
disincentive.
people, you know, as a disincentive, I just wonder about its effectiveness when so few people know about stories like yourself. Like you're not, you know, like we've mentioned before, there are people that have been political prisoners for 33 years, etc. There were, and when they were released, it's nobody, not nobody, but the vast majority of Singaporeans didn't know about them.
True,
you know,
that's true. Yeah, but the people that they want to deter, in every society, there's always a very small number who are more intellectually inclined to be critical. And that is this group of people that they want to ensure that if you are critical, keep within a safe space. The worst thing to do is to start organizing. If you are radical and eccentric, you are safe. And if you are critical but accept that, okay, you be a non-constituency nominated MP, they love you because you are the acceptable voice of the opposition. You do not have a constituency, but that creates the semblance of democracy. Oh, we still have someone who can speak out in parliament. And that is then used to negate the need for an opposition party. You see? So they will make, and I have a friend who was at one time a very vocal radio commentator. And in fact, he was very much supported, encouraged by the ruling party because that is within a safe space. They can turn on and turn off the agenda by create that semblance of democracy. And then there is their defense. They say, how can you say Singapore is an autocratic state when so and so could make his comments on television?
Yeah.
Do you find
that is why some of the critics, like those who published the online Citizen, they are perpetually subjected to threats of libel law or for breaching Broadcasting Act or whatever legislation because they are organized with a platform.
Oh, okay. So as long as they see that you don't have a growing, you know, movement behind you, you're safe. You can say
that's right. So long as you
within
can't reach out. Yes.
Do you find, I know you haven't been back to Singapore, but do you hear anything about the new generation or the youth who are speaking up? Are there any activists or have they just been so effectively silenced that there isn't anyone?
Oh, no. There is a core of activists, and they have emerged at different stages of the history, different stages since 1976 when I left. After I left in 1976, in 1987, they arrested the whole group of youth, some of whom are my friends, and for that was that conspiracy to set up a Marxist state, which is all nonsense. So that was a generation, and because of that repression in 1987, some of those who are in A levels and so on, watching the news, disbelieve it. So that created another new group that emerged about 20 years later. So you have this kind of a cycle. So there are, but the difference is that partly because of social media and so on, each one of them are able to articulate their dissent within the kind of narrow framework, either through Facebook or through the arts and so on. And what it lacks is an organized platform, as we see in the West, and that is the main difference. And unless people have the platform to organize politically at the mass level, you are not going to affect change, because the only way to effect change is through the ballot box. And how are you going to reach out unless you are organized at that political level? And that is the problem in Singapore society at the moment politically.
I mean, honestly, when you describe it that way, I think there is a similar problem here that we have of the progressive left. Like there is no, our ability to organize has been somewhat hamstrung, and our political parties have been co-opted by the establishment. So, even in an established democracy like the UK, we're kind of struggling.
Oh, yes. I'm a member of the Labour Party, for example. I'm even an officer in my local area, but I wouldn't even bother to raise the issues which are close at heart, the Palestinian issues, the issues of the way they are going around with China bashing. And because those views of mine doesn't fall within the framework of the present leadership, it's not on message. So a couple of times I did discuss with a couple of my colleagues within the local party branch, but it's no point even to try to push for a resolution. And that is how disenfranchised we are. So when we talk about we are living in a democratic state, and this is why few weeks ago, and Ileana, you were with me, I had to do my one-man protest as a symbolic protest against the lack of dissent within Parliament, the lack of dissent, differing views within British politics on this China question, when they are full of lies, but nobody, no media will pick it up.
Where is the left? That's what I'm really disappointed about. Is I think over the last few years, and 2015 and Brexit and Trump and that kind of thing, a lot of people would talk about echo chambers and polarization, and everybody has such different opinions, and we need to meet in the middle. And I think, you know what, the left and the right, in terms of their opinions on foreign policy, are exactly the same. In 2003, the left was all against the Iraq war in 2003. People were protesting. I forgot, was it 1 million people on the streets or something like that?
Something like that.
And the anti-war left has completely disappeared.
Oh, yes. In fact, they are competing. They are competing with each other on the American agenda to focus on an enemy. And the reason why they need, for me, my own analysis is why the left and the liberals are focusing on China, to bash China on human rights, is because it makes them feel good. They realize that there is a problem with the essence of democracy, the essence of this representation for the people, of the people. America is the greatest disaster. So their narrative of what democracy should be is not delivering. Even Biden at G7 say, as a liberal, our liberal values must show that it can benefit the people. It means that it has not. Right. And because of that, to make them feel good, they will start promoting we are bashing those states which are undemocratic, to feel that they are doing something for this mission. What democracy is, how is it reflected in Western society, let alone in China or the rest of the world? I mean, look at COVID-19, look at the corruption that is going on with the disbursement. How many millionaires has been created under our very nose and scrutiny in Britain itself? I mean, it's a disgrace.
It is a disgrace. And I think one thing that really disturbed me just lately was the British gas strike, that happened a few months ago. And there was no coverage of it at all. And the only reason I even know about it was, I did watch it on Novara Media, which is an independent news source here. And I talked to one of the gas engineers about it. That's the only reason, those two sources, complete blackout. And he was just, when I was talking to this British gas engineer, he was just quite heartbroken at the idea that they fought, they striked, everybody ignored them. And their contract has been, British Gas basically got their own way, and their contract has been rolled back. Even though they worked through COVID, they worked through the pandemic, they risked their lives, etc., and to have their contract rolled back, and for us to not care at all about our own workers. I don't know how something like that, which is that's very British. Okay, so if you're thinking that someone in the UK who's maybe never been abroad, I don't know, right? They're going to care about their own selves. That is the quintessential British problem. And that can't even get any traction. So
and that is interesting because you still have organized, you still have unions which are big, and yet when do you hear the unions able to flex their muscles about this thing about NHS nurses who gets a pay rise of £3 a month? Yes, and that is despite all the COVID-19 praising, the clapping, and so on. And this is most cynical of the system where you clap.
I cannot wait to go to, is Marks and Spencer still open? I cannot wait to go to Marks and Spencer's or Selfridges or something like that and pick up a nice shirt and then take it to the counter, and then when they ask me for payment, start clapping. I'm glad we can play. Forget Bitcoin. We can pay in claps these days. It sounds amazing,
Yeah.
I'm so glad that we can now all pay each other in claps.
So glad, yes. Yeah.
No, seriously, there is a problem with democracy in the West.
Yes.
there is a problem, and they
should
are
invade
spending
themselves.
all their energy to say we champion democracy abroad.
Yeah.
And yet Biden is having a problem with the dysfunctional democracy in United States itself.
Sure.